This PowerPoint presentation is to give you tips on how to answer a data analysis, which is a paper 2 in economics. In higher level, the paper 2 will be 30% of your final mark, and if you are standard level, it will be 40%. Paper 2 is a data analysis or a case study, generally a page long. In May, in your final exam, you will have 2 data analyses in international trade where you choose one, and you will be presented with 2 data analyses in development economics and you choose one. And you should allocate 45 minutes to each data analysis. Format of the paper. Part A is always 2 definitions worth 2 marks each, so the whole Part A is worth 4 marks. 1 mark for vague definition, 2 marks for precise definition with all necessary points. And note, if you can include a formula, if it's relevant, or a diagram quickly, do so. So examples, if you were asked to define price elasticity of demand, that would lend itself to quickly showing the formula as well as a definition, or a price floor again, definition with a very fast diagram. This way, in case you have missed something in the written definition, hopefully you would get full marks by having the correct formula or diagram. Part B is always to draw and explain a diagram. 2 marks for a correct diagram and correctly labeled, and 2 marks for the explanation. Part C is sometimes a question like Part B, or you're asked to explain an economic concept. You do not want to be spending a lot of time on A, B, and C, even though when you add them up together, they're worth more than, I believe, half. They are worth more than half of what the data analysis is worth. This is really testing your knowledge of economics. You don't want to include evaluation. You want to be succinct and save your time for Part D. So when you see we're going to go through a sample data analysis, you'll see that the explanations are to the point but quite brief for B and C, and the definitions are not terribly long for A either. Part D, 8 marks and includes evaluation. You really want to be saving your time for Part D because that's going to distinguish an IB 6 or 7 paper. It's in Part D, as I said, where you include evaluation. So just a reminder, viewpoint of different stakeholders such as low and high income consumers, producers, government, and if you're doing international trade, you might want to bring in the viewpoint of the rest of the world. Advantages and disadvantages, short-term versus long-term, or prioritize the arguments. In answering the question, go through each sentence of the data analysis carefully and see if it's relevant. If so, include the information in your answer. Only having absolutely exhausted the case study, then think of other arguments to add. For full marks, you also need to include actual numbers from the case study and/or brief quotes, to demonstrate that you have used the information from the text. Because when they say use the information from the text, they mean it literally. Bring out specific information from the text and show that you are using it. So we're going to look at a data analysis called Rising Grain Prices Are Felt Throughout the World. So in the next few slides, we will include the case study. Generally, it's 1 page on an 8.5 by 11 in length, and then we'll look at parts A, B, C, and D and how to answer them. I'm going to leave the next 2 pages for you to read on your own, so pause the video to give yourself time. And then we will pick up again with the definitions from Part A. All right, so here is Part A. So you're asked to define market, and where you see here it says text 1, that's giving you reference as to where you can find that term, so you can put it in context if that helps you. And then fiscal policy in text 3. Note that they're 2 marks each. So a market, you might not remember the definition. It's been a long time since you've seen it. Oh, and by the way, even though this is international economics, you might be asked to include definitions or diagrams for micro or macro or international trade. So it's not all uniquely related to international trade. So a market is where buyers and sellers come together to exchange goods and services or to make an economic transaction. You would get 2 marks for that. If you were to give a vague answer, such as the idea that is to do with demand and supply, you would get 1 out of the 2 marks. So write down what you can remember and what makes sense to you. I would say more is better than less, but keep it to like 2 or 3 lines. Don't write half a page on a definition. Fiscal policy, what comes to mind for me is that it's 1, a demand side policy, and it's comprised of government spending and taxation. Now, it doesn't say on the data analysis, but they are looking for 2 points. So the demand side policy would be 1, and the government spending and taxation would be the 2nd point. They also said that they'd be happy if one of the points was to shift the AD curve, or if one of the points was to achieve economic objectives relating to inflation and unemployment. So you can see it is somewhat forgiving in terms of what it's looking for. A vague answer that would get you 1 mark is that the idea it has to do with government economic policy. And once again, if appropriate and you can quickly draw a relevant diagram or include a relevant equation, do so. Of course, in this case, it's not necessary. B, the question was, using an appropriate diagram, explain why bakeries across Israel want the ceiling on bread removed. And they refer you to text 2, so you can go back to that 2nd box and reread it to get a sense of what's going on. So let's look at the diagram first on the right. If it's correctly labeled, the price of bread, quantity of bread, it's showing the price ceiling, it's showing the shortage, and I would have included sort of a bracketing for the shortage, but I was having difficulty finding it on the computer. That would even be better. So you'd get 2 marks for the diagram. Now we want to be able to explain why bakeries want the ceiling on price removed. Well, if the price ceiling on bread was removed, then being quite precise, we can say the price would rise to the equilibrium price, in other words, from PC to PE until the shortage disappeared. And the quantity supplied would increase from QS to QE, thereby increasing the baker's total revenue. So the explanation would get you the other 2 points. So here in C, it is again referring to a diagram as opposed to just an economic concept. So they want you to explain why a reduction in the tariff on wheat in Swaziland would certainly help consumers. And again, they refer you to text 3, the 3rd box, to be able to put it in context. I would strongly suggest that you show the tariff decreasing, not the tariff being eliminated and returning to the world price. So on the diagram, we have price of wheat, quantity of wheat. We've got the world supply curve equaling world price. Remember to include both of those when labeling that curve. We have 2 tariff lines, one which is higher, the tariff world price plus tariff 1, dropping down to world price plus tariff 2. Include all of this and you would have the 2 marks out of 4. The explanation: a reduction in the tariff would decrease the price of the Swazi consumers from PW plus T1 to PW plus T2, or however you've labeled it, as long as it's clear, and the quantity demanded by consumers would increase. So this is how it would help consumers, twofold. Prices decreased, but also the quantity that they consume has increased. D. D says always using information from the text or data and your knowledge of economics. That's how all Part Ds start off, so that's why you have to quote from the text. Evaluate, and there's always evaluation in D, the removal of the set-aside policy in the European Union and the reduction of tariffs in Swaziland as responses to the shortage of wheat. So I'm going to replicate again the case study on the next 2 slides, and we're going to go through it together line by line to see what is relevant to answer this question. I'm not going to write down everything. We're going to discuss it. You can write it down. Remember to cite figures and use brief quotes to get full marks. Only after the case study has been exhausted, and if you have time, will you then think of any other issues which would also answer the question. But I mean, I don't want to be absolutely dogmatic about this. If you're going through the case study and other thoughts pop into your mind of how this might relate, then by all means include them at that point. But keep going through the case study until you've exhausted it. Text 1. The European Union agrees on a plan to increase wheat production. So to keep this in mind, we are looking at evaluating the removal of the set-aside policy and the reduction of tariffs as responses to the shortage of wheat. So we're evaluating them as whether they're going to be effective or not to deal with this shortage of wheat. EU agriculture ministers approved plans to increase production of wheat and other grains across the 27-nation union in response to growing shortages on the world market. Okay, so let's look at what they did. The decision means European grain farmers can ignore the set-aside policy. So European grain farmers can ignore the set-aside policy. Which means that now they can use, where they have to set aside 10% of their total land, they can now use that 10% of their total land. So this means that, so this is what I would include, that now that they can plant on 10% more of their land, this will enable more wheat production. So it was originally set to prevent overproduction. So as I said, this will help increase production. On a negative side, however, because we are looking at evaluation, advantages and disadvantages, you might want to mention that what might be harmed, however, is the natural habitats of wildlife. EU officials said that the increase in land is needed urgently to address the problems caused by poor harvest in Europe, Australia, elsewhere this year. So you could mention that this will hopefully help to offset these poor harvests, that there have been droughts, and the restrictions on how many crops could be grown, and we have unstable market prices. So hopefully this is going to help to stabilize market prices by increasing the amount of land available for farming. Consumers around the world have seen prices rise sharply for bread, pasta, and meat products in recent weeks because of the increased cost of wheat and other grains. So hopefully who will be helped will be consumers with lower prices available for consumption. The removal of the set-aside policy has been welcomed. As the world's population increases, so does the demand for food. So perhaps you might want to mention that the shortage has also been caused by the world's population increasing and the demand for food increasing. And so it really is needed for producers to be allowed to produce more. So in other words, less government intervention. The set-aside policy has favored inefficient and underproductive producers at the expense of efficient and productive markets. So you could zero in here and say, well, with the removal of the set-aside policies, who might be hurt are the inefficient and unproductive producers. So again, from the viewpoint of different stakeholders, the inefficient and unproductive producers may be forced out of business. And who might benefit will be the efficient and productive producers. Now, just going back to the inefficient and unproductive producers, even though it doesn't say this at this time, you may want to emphasize the fact that unemployment might increase, particularly in the smaller businesses. Market forces should be allowed to prevail. Well, I think what I would probably mention is that because of the set-aside policy, it's distorted the market, and so now the competitive market has been distorted, and so now maybe market forces will be allowed to prevail. Text 2. Text 2 probably does not have anything to do with answering the question, because we've been asked to look at the removal of the set-aside policy and the reduction of tariffs. But let's go through it just in case. So bakers in Israel demand the removal of price ceilings. Following the sharp increase in flour prices this year, due to the international shortages of wheat, bakeries across Israel are threatening to stop the supply of bread to consumers unless the government removes the ceiling price on bread. Well, it's not really that much of a stretch, but assuming that with increasing wheat production, that flour prices would decrease, so we would have the opposite happening here, we could see that this would help the bakeries across Israel with cheaper wheat. Anyway, it's a thought. So text 3, again, we've been asked to evaluate the reductions of tariffs in Swaziland. So a call for the reductions of tariffs in Swaziland. An increase in the price of bread is certain in response to the rising price of wheat. Okay, so we know that this has been a problem. Okay, wheat suppliers said they would be increasing the price of wheat by 35% because of the world shortage of wheat. So this is problematic. So they're saying one way of handling the problem would be to be reducing the existing 8.5% tariff on wheat. So if they reduce the tariff on wheat, that 35% increase at least would be softened. And then coupling that with an increase in production, the price would come down even more. So it even says in the text it's going to help consumers, it's going to, but domestic producers of wheat would face increased competition from imports. So if they couldn't compete, again, you might have a problem with unemployment in Swaziland. Also, because of the tariffs have been revenue for the government, so government spending on infrastructure could be threatened. So we could have less money for government expenditure, less money for infrastructure, and we may even now have to increase taxes. So as you probably see, we've underlined quite a bit in the text. You need to tease out sort of the ramifications of what these things mean, but by all means exhaust what's in the text first. Now, a few things that the desk copy mentions that aren't in the text itself, I'll just write them out here. So we could talk about lower food prices may lower inflation rates. In the EU and Swaziland. We talked about how the increased competition could lead to unemployment, whether it's in Swaziland or in the EU. We talked about how infrastructure, there might not be money for infrastructure, but because we're dealing with a developing country, we could also say that development objectives, because if they don't have the money from the tariff revenues, they may not be able to meet the development objectives. So the development objectives may be threatened. And we did talk about how things like set-aside policies and tariffs could distort the competitive market. And we also talked about how the loss of tariff revenue might lead to higher taxation. So hopefully you were okay that we went through verbally the things you could talk about in the data analysis. If you need to, go back and listen to that again and make a note as you go through. But this is in essence how to tackle a data analysis. Thank you.